It was a Sunday night in November 1875, and fog was rolling off the Thames, the thick yellow kind Victorians called a pea souper, so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. In the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of St. James and the grand dining rooms of Mayfair, the most powerful men in the world were finishing elaborate Sunday dinners, discussing the usual preoccupations of the Victorian elite: fluctuating coal prices, Irish unrest, Afghan campaigns, and the seemingly endless expansion of the British Empire. But in a private room at 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli was not eating. He was pacing, hands clasped behind his back, mind racing. He held a secret telegram that had just arrived by courier from Cairo. The paper was thin, the handwriting hurried, but the message was heavy enough to sink a battleship. The telegram said the Khedive of Egypt, ruler of the most strategically vital piece of territory on earth, was broke. Not just struggling, but catastrophically, irreversibly bankrupt. And in desperation, he was willing to sell his most prized asset, his shares in the Suez Canal Company. To understand why this made the Prime Minister sweat, why his heart raced and his political instincts sharpened, we need to understand what the world looked like in 1875 and what the Suez Canal meant to the British Empire. The world in 1875. Steam, speed, and strategic choke points. This was the peak of the Industrial Revolution, the age of steam and steel. The world was shrinking. Steamships, traveling regardless of wind, were the arteries of the global economy, carrying manufactured goods, raw materials, troops, and gold across oceans. And the Suez Canal, opened just 6 years earlier in 1869, was rapidly becoming the beating heart of that system. Before the canal, a merchant ship or military vessel traveling from London to Bombay, Liverpool to Calcutta, or Southampton to Singapore had to sail around the entire continent of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope. It was approximately 11,000 miles, taking 3 to 4 months. Dangerous, exhausting, expensive. Ships needed enormous coal supplies. Crews faced storms, disease, piracy, and mechanical failure far from any port. When the Suez Canal opened in November 1869, everything changed. The canal sliced through 120 miles of Egyptian desert, connecting the Mediterranean at Port Said to the Red Sea at Suez. It cut the journey to India roughly in half, from 11,000 miles to about 6,000. Travel time dropped from months to weeks. Fuel consumption plummeted. The strategic and economic implications were staggering. For the British Empire, which relied utterly on India for wealth, power, and prestige, the canal wasn't just a convenient shortcut. It was the jugular vein of the empire, the single most critical piece of infrastructure in the entire imperial system. India was the jewel in the crown, a subcontinent of 300 million people providing raw materials, cotton, tea, opium, indigo, vast markets for British goods, and soldiers. The Indian army was larger than Britain's own. India generated enormous wealth flowing back to London. The entire British financial system, the City of London's dominance of global finance, rested significantly on the India trade. If the Suez Canal closed, war, sabotage, political crisis, the British economy would suffer immediate, catastrophic shock. If another hostile power like France or Russia gained control, they could hold Britain hostage, dictate terms, potentially cut off access entirely during conflict. That strategic nightmare kept British military planners awake at night. And here was the problem, the painful, humiliating reality. Britain did not own the canal. Britain didn't even have significant influence over it. The French Canal, a project Britain opposed in fact. When the canal was first proposed in the 1850s, Britain opposed it vehemently, almost hysterically. British engineers declared it technically impossible to build a sea-level canal through desert sand. They predicted catastrophic failures, that it would fill with sand within months, never be commercially viable. British politicians saw more clearly. It was a French plot. The canal was the brainchild of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a charismatic French diplomat who'd secured the concession from Egypt. French investors provided most capital. French engineers supervised construction. French companies supplied equipment. Britain feared France was using the canal to establish permanent strategic influence over Egypt and the route to India. Britain had spent decades cultivating relations with the Ottoman Empire, of which Egypt was nominally part, precisely to prevent any rival European power gaining a foothold along this critical route. So Britain tried sabotaging the project diplomatically, pressuring the Ottoman Sultan to withdraw permission. When that failed, British newspapers predicted the canal would be an expensive failure, bankrupting investors within a decade. But they were wrong. The canal opened in November 1869 with an extravagant ceremony attended by European royalty. Within a few years, it was an enormous commercial success. Ship traffic grew rapidly. Tolls generated substantial revenue. Stock prices climbed steadily. The most humiliating fact: British ships used the canal more than any other nation. By 1875, approximately 80% of ships passing through flew the British flag. Britain's empire depended on a waterway owned and controlled by France. The ownership structure was simple. French private investors owned approximately 52%. The Egyptian government, specifically Khedive Ismail Pasha, owned the remaining 44%. A small percentage was held by various other investors. This meant effective control rested with French investors and French management. Britain was the primary customer but had no ownership stake, no board seat, no voice in strategic decisions. For years, British politicians watched helplessly, frustrated and anxious, as French ships, French flags, and French administrators dominated the most important waterway in the world. But now, on this foggy Sunday in November 1875, the balance of power was about to shift, if Britain could move fast enough. Ismail Pasha, the Khedive who bankrupted Egypt. The man selling the shares was Ismail Pasha, Khedive of Egypt, a figure of immense ambition, vision, and ultimately tragic, catastrophic flaws. Ismail became Khedive in 1863, inheriting a country nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but effectively independent internally. He was a modernizer who looked at Europe, particularly France, with admiration bordering on obsession. When Ismail came to power, he looked at dusty, medieval Cairo and decided to transform Egypt into a modern European-style state. He would turn Cairo into the Paris on the Nile. He famously declared, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe." And he spent money as if this declaration could make it true. The scope of spending was breathtaking, almost delusional. He built grand opera houses and palatial residences. He constructed thousands of miles of telegraph lines. He built over 900 miles of railways, more than any other African or Middle Eastern country. He built 430 bridges. He established modern schools and sent Egyptian students to study in European universities. He hired European experts, Italian architects, French engineers, French chefs. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Ismail threw arguably the most extravagant party the world had ever seen. He invited European royalty, including Empress Eugenie of France, the Emperor of Austria, and the Crown Prince of Prussia. He built a special road from the pyramids so the Empress's carriage wouldn't raise dust. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write the opera Aida specifically for the opening celebrations, though it wasn't actually ready and premiered 2 years later. He built a new opera house in Cairo specifically to stage it. Celebrations lasted weeks. Champagne flowed like the Nile. Diamonds and gifts were distributed like party favors. The cost was estimated at millions of pounds. But there was a dark, unsustainable foundation. Ismail didn't have revenue to pay for any of it. He was borrowing massively from European banks. The debt trap: how Egypt was bankrupted. Egypt's bankruptcy is a case study in predatory lending, bad timing, and financial imperialism. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, a cotton boom temporarily made Egypt wealthy. The Union blockade of Confederate ports cut off world cotton supply. Prices skyrocketed globally. Egypt, producing high-quality long-staple cotton, became a primary supplier. Money poured in. Ismail, seeing this windfall, assumed prosperity would continue indefinitely. He borrowed heavily against future cotton revenues from European banks, primarily British and French, to finance modernization. But when the Civil War ended in 1865, American cotton flooded back. Prices collapsed. Egyptian revenue plummeted. Suddenly, loans taken during boom years became unsustainable. But Ismail didn't stop spending. He couldn't. Projects were underway. Commitments were made. His vision required continued investment. So he kept borrowing. The European bankers, seeing an increasingly desperate client, raised interest rates dramatically. Early loans carried around 7%. But as Ismail's position deteriorated, rates climbed to 10%, 12%, 15%, eventually reaching 20% and higher on some loans. The bankers in London and Paris knew Ismail was heading toward bankruptcy. They knew he'd likely never fully repay principal, but interest rates were so lucrative they couldn't resist. They calculated that even if Ismail defaulted, they'd profit substantially from interest payments in the meantime. Predatory lending on a national scale. And it worked for the bankers. By 1875, Egypt's situation was catastrophic. The country owed approximately £100 million, an incomprehensible sum, equivalent to many billions today. Annual interest payments alone consumed roughly two-thirds of Egypt's entire government revenue. Two-thirds of all taxes, customs duties, government revenue, all went straight to European banks before Egypt could spend a single pound on salaries, infrastructure, or defense. Ismail was essentially robbing his own country to pay European creditors. Tax collectors squeezed peasants ruthlessly. Soldiers went unpaid. Teachers went unpaid. Government officials went unpaid. The entire administrative structure was on the verge of collapse. In November 1875, a major debt payment, several million pounds, was due in weeks. The treasury was empty. Ismail faced imminent humiliation of default, which would likely trigger European intervention and possibly a military coup by his unpaid army. He had one card left, his 44% shareholding in the Suez Canal Company, valued at approximately £4 million. He didn't want to sell these shares. They were the family silver, an income-generating asset paying regular dividends, giving Egypt at least some voice in canal management. But Ismail had no choice. Sell the shares or face complete collapse. He quietly let it be known to the French government that he was willing to sell for £4 million cash, immediately. The French opportunity and the British leak. The French government was thrilled. This was an opportunity to consolidate French control permanently. If France acquired Ismail's 44%, added to the 52% already held by French investors, France would own essentially the entire canal. The Mediterranean and Red Sea would become French strategic waters. The route to India would be in French hands. French officials began drafting contracts and arranging financing. They moved with deliberate speed, confident that Britain, bureaucratic, committee-driven, bound by parliamentary procedure, could never match their agility. But there was a leak. Information, particularly involving enormous sums, rarely stays secret. A British journalist named Frederick Greenwood, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, heard a rumor at a London dinner party, the kind of casual indiscretion that changes history. Someone mentioned the Khedive was selling canal shares to France. Greenwood, an experienced newspaperman with good instincts, immediately recognized the significance. He rushed to the Foreign Office and informed Lord Derby, the Foreign Secretary. Derby, cautious, was initially skeptical but agreed to investigate. When information was confirmed through diplomatic channels, Darby immediately informed Prime Minister Disraeli. That's how the telegram ended up on Disraeli's desk on that foggy Sunday night. Benjamin Disraeli. The romantic imperialist Benjamin Disraeli was 70 years old in 1875, at the height of his political power and nearing the end of his career. He was one of the most extraordinary figures in British political history, a novelist who became Prime Minister, a Jewish-born outsider who reached the pinnacle of the British establishment, a romantic imperialist who believed passionately in Britain's destiny to rule. Disraeli had been born into a Jewish family but was baptized Christian at age 12. This conversion allowed him to enter Parliament. Jews weren't permitted until 1858, but he never entirely escaped Victorian anti-Semitism. Political opponents made vicious comments about his foreign appearance and background. But Disraeli turned his outsider status into an asset. He was flamboyant where others were dull, bold where they were cautious, visionary where they were bureaucratic. He wore elaborate clothing, wrote romantic novels, and spoke in Parliament with theatrical flair. His great rival, William Gladstone, was his opposite, moralistic, earnest, cautious, devoted to fiscal responsibility and limited government. Disraeli believed in empire, in glory, in Britain's mission to civilize and rule. He'd convinced Queen Victoria to adopt the title Empress of India in 1876. He saw the Suez Canal purchase as his chance to secure India's safety forever, to pull off a masterstroke of imperial statecraft. When he read the telegram from Cairo, Disraeli saw the opportunity immediately. If he could buy those shares, he'd secure the route to India indefinitely. He'd turn a French project into a British asset. He'd outmaneuver France diplomatically without firing a shot. He'd pull off the greatest coup of the century. But there was a seemingly insurmountable problem: time and money. The £4 million problem. The Khedive needed money immediately, by week's end, perhaps within 48 to 72 hours, or he'd default. £4 million in 1875 was a colossal sum, equivalent to well over £400 million today, possibly over $600 million adjusting for purchasing power. Disraeli looked at the calendar and realized he was trapped by constitutional procedure. Parliament was in recess, not in session, with members scattered across the country at their estates. Under British constitutional law, the government couldn't spend a single penny without explicit parliamentary approval. The power of the purse belonged to Parliament, not the executive. Disraeli couldn't simply write a check from the Treasury. He had no legal authority to commit £4 million on his own. If he waited for Parliament to be recalled, to debate, to vote, the process would take weeks, possibly months. By then, the Khedive would be bankrupt or the French would have bought the shares. The opportunity would be gone forever. The French government didn't have this problem. France had more centralized financial authority. French officials had cash reserves ready. They were already drafting purchase contracts, confident the deal would be theirs. Disraeli sat at his desk, staring into the fireplace. He was tired, 70 years old, suffering from asthma and gout, his health failing. He was surrounded by political enemies, rivals who resented his flamboyant style and Jewish background, and facing hostile opposition led by Gladstone, who would have been horrified by spending £4 million on a secret foreign adventure. Gladstone believed in peace, retrenchment, and reform, avoiding foreign wars, reducing spending, slow domestic improvements. He'd have demanded committees, studies, debates, votes. He represented everything Disraeli opposed: caution, hesitation, moral hand-wringing. Disraeli believed in action, in seizing moments, in glory. He knew with absolute certainty that if he let this moment pass, if he allowed bureaucratic procedure to paralyze him, the opportunity would never come again. Britain would watch helplessly as France secured canal control. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean en route to India would shift decisively against Britain. He had to find £4 million in 48 hours without telling Parliament, without alerting the French, without leaving time for political enemies to sabotage the deal. He called his private secretary, Montagu Corey, into the room. Corey was young, fiercely loyal, utterly devoted to Disraeli. The Prime Minister looked at him with tired eyes and asked a question that sounded almost like a joke. "Where can we find £4 million by Tuesday?" Corey didn't laugh. He understood immediately the old man was deadly serious. The search for £4 million, they went through options systematically, like generals planning a desperate operation. The Bank of England, the obvious first choice. The bank managed Britain's gold reserves and currency. Surely they could provide funds, but the governor was cautious, conservative, bound by strict rules. He'd never agree to lend such a massive sum for a secret political gamble without parliamentary approval. He'd demand paperwork, authorization, committee approvals, a vote. There was no time for procedures. Other banks. Britain had other large commercial banks, Barings, Coutts, others. But none had individual liquidity to move £4 million in gold and securities within 48 hours. Disraeli needed a private source of financing, someone with enough international liquidity to move millions in gold at a moment's notice. Someone who operated across borders, who could mobilize resources in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt simultaneously. Someone who trusted him personally, who understood this wasn't just a financial transaction but a geopolitical masterstroke worth the risk. There was only one name that fit: the House of Rothschild. The Rothschilds. The bank that financed empires, the House of Rothschild, was the most powerful financial dynasty in the world. Founded by Mayor Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt in the late 18th century, the family had established banking branches in 5 major European capitals: Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, Naples, and London. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds made their fortune financing governments, moving gold across war-torn Europe, and maintaining financial communications when normal channels broke down. After Waterloo, they became the primary financiers of European governments. They funded wars, built railroads, financed industrial projects, and supported monarchies. Kings and emperors sought their counsel and credit. The head of the London branch in 1875 was Lionel de Rothschild, son of Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who'd built the London operation into the most powerful branch. Lionel was a personal friend of Disraeli, more than a friend, actually. They shared a bond forged by their experiences as outsiders in British society. Disraeli had been born Jewish but baptized Christian. Lionel de Rothschild was a practicing Jew who'd fought for over a decade to take his seat in Parliament. He was first elected in 1847, but because the parliamentary oath contained "on the true faith of a Christian," he couldn't take his seat. He was re-elected repeatedly, each time refusing the Christian oath. Finally, in 1858, Parliament changed the rules, and Lionel became the first practicing Jew to sit in the House of Commons, a breakthrough Disraeli had actively supported. They understood each other. They trusted each other. And Disraeli knew that if anyone in the world could mobilize £4 million in 48 hours, it was the Rothschilds. The midnight ride to New Court, Disraeli turned to Montagu Corey and gave him a verbal order that would echo through history. He told him to go immediately, tonight, now to the City of London, to N.M. Rothschild and Sons headquarters at New Court in St. Swithin's Lane. Corey asked the obvious question: what security should he offer? Security is the collateral you give a lender, usually land, gold, bonds, or stocks. Disraeli had none of those. He didn't even have legal authority to offer government bonds without parliamentary approval. He looked at Corey and said simply, "Tell him the security is the British government." It was a magnificent bluff. Disraeli was betting his entire career, his reputation, possibly his freedom, on a handshake. If Parliament refused to ratify the deal, Disraeli would be finished, accused of illegally committing public funds, impeached, possibly prosecuted. He might go to prison. The scandal would bring down the government, and the Rothschilds would lose their money, £4 million, a staggering sum even for them. But Disraeli was a gambler. Before politics, he'd written romantic novels filled with adventure and intrigue. He understood drama. He understood that sometimes history is made not by committees or bureaucracies, but by individuals willing to risk everything on a single decisive moment. Montagu Corey put on his coat and walked into the foggy London night. He hailed a horse-drawn carriage and told the driver to take him to the city. The streets were mostly quiet. Gas lamps flickered in the damp air, creating yellow halos in the fog. Corey sat in darkness, knowing that the fate of the Middle East, the security of the route to India, and the future of the British Empire were riding with him through the London fog. Meanwhile in Cairo, Khedive Ismail was pacing in his palace, desperate and frantic. French agents were pressing him to sign their contract immediately. They had documents ready. They told him the British were too slow, too bureaucratic, that Parliament would never approve such risky expenditure. They urged him not to wait. Ismail stalled, hoping for word from London. He preferred dealing with the British, less likely to interfere in Egyptian internal affairs, but he was desperate. If the British didn't come through by the next day, he'd sign with France. The clock was ticking. The meeting at New Court. Grapes and gold. Corey's carriage arrived at New Court. It wasn't an imposing building from the outside. The Rothschilds deliberately avoided ostentatious displays, but inside it was a palace of finance, the nerve center of international capital. Corey was ushered quickly into a private room where Lionel de Rothschild was waiting. The legend of this meeting has been told and retold, but the core remains one of the most cinematic moments in financial history. According to the most famous version, recounted by Disraeli himself and various witnesses, Baron Lionel de Rothschild was sitting at his desk, calmly eating muscatel grapes. He was a man of immense composure, legendary for remaining utterly calm during crises that would send other men into panic. He didn't look up immediately when Corey entered. He continued eating his grapes slowly, methodically, spitting seeds and skins onto a silver plate. The gesture wasn't rude. It was a deliberate display of power, a reminder of who held leverage in this negotiation. Corey stood there, heart pounding, mouth dry. He delivered the message with as much composure as he could muster. He said Mr. Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, needed £4 million immediately, by tomorrow if possible, no later than Tuesday. Lionel de Rothschild paused. He picked up another grape. He examined it. Then he asked the obvious question, "What is your security?" Corey replied exactly as instructed, with words that have become legendary. The British government. No contracts, no bonds, no gold, no land. Just the word of the Prime Minister and the implicit promise that Parliament would eventually ratify the deal. The Baron paused again. He ate the grape thoughtfully. The silence stretched. Corey felt seconds passing like hours. Then Lionel de Rothschild said simply, decisively, "You shall have it." Just like that, the deal was done. No lawyers summoned. No 20-page contracts drafted. No board meeting. No committee approval. It was a gentleman's agreement between the Prime Minister of the world's greatest empire and the head of the world's greatest bank, sealed with a handshake and the eating of a grape. Rothschild agreed to advance the full £4 million immediately, charging a commission of approximately £100,000, about 2.5% plus interest, until Parliament could be recalled and the loan formally approved. Substantial, but reasonable given the risk and speed required. The Rothschilds immediately began mobilizing their vast international network. They sent urgent messages to branches in Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt. They began gathering gold reserves and preparing securities for transfer. Within hours, the financial machinery was in motion. The lesson: debt as a weapon of empire. When we look back at that meeting in November 1875, at the fog rolling off the Thames, at the grapes on the silver plate, at the desperate telegram from Cairo, we're looking at the birth of modern financial imperialism. We're looking at the moment when the power of finance definitively superseded the power of traditional sovereignty. The British didn't need to invade Egypt with an army in 1875. They just needed a checkbook and a willing lender. The army came later, 7 years later, to collect the bill and enforce the terms. The Suez Canal purchase teaches us a lesson that remains powerfully relevant today. Debt is a weapon. Predatory lending, unsustainable loans, and financial dependency can be more effective tools of imperial control than military conquest. Egypt in the 1870s isn't so different from dozens of countries today that find themselves trapped in debt to international financial institutions, foreign governments, international creditors. The mechanisms are more sophisticated, the language more polite, but the underlying power dynamic remains the same. When a country becomes desperate, when it needs cash immediately to avoid collapse, it will sell anything: shares, land, sovereignty itself. And creditors, whether European banks in the 1870s or international financial institutions today, are always waiting, always ready to extend loans at high interest rates, knowing that the debt itself becomes a form of control. Sometimes the most dangerous invasion force isn't a regiment of soldiers marching under a flag. Sometimes it's a piece of paper signed in a quiet room by a desperate man, a loan agreement that seems like salvation but becomes a chain. The £4 million Britain paid for Suez Canal shares bought far more than 44% of a shipping company. It bought a century of British dominance in the Middle East. It bought the borders of the modern Middle East. It bought 72 years of occupation. It bought the resentment, the nationalist movements, the revolutions that would eventually expel the British but leave behind a legacy of artificial borders, authoritarian governments, and regional instability, all from a handshake and a plate of grapes on a foggy Sunday night in London. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.